The silk of Lady Elara Vance's gown was a whisper of a bygone season, a pale primrose yellow that had been fashionable the previous year. Now, under the tyrannical blaze of 1,000 candles in the Duke of Beaumont's ballroom, it seemed faded, a ghost of a garment clinging to a ghost of a debutante. She felt the whispers like pinpricks against her skin, the sidelong glances of the other young ladies in their fresh from the modiste confections of ivory, rose, and cerulean. They were blooms in a hothouse, and she a pressed flower from an old book. Her father's disastrous investments had seen to that. The Vance name, once a respectable cornerstone of the county gentry, was now a hollowed-out edifice, propped up by little more than pride and the rapidly dwindling funds from the sale of her mother's pearls. This ball, this entire London season, was their final desperate gamble. Elara was the last coin they had to toss, and she was to be tossed in the direction of any reasonably solvent, reasonably tolerable bachelor who might be persuaded to overlook a missing dowry in favor of a pretty face and an old name. She stood near a wilting arrangement of ferns, the fronds drooping in the oppressive heat, and felt a kinship with them. Her fan, a simple thing of painted paper, beat a frantic, useless rhythm against the humid air. Her chaperone, her weary Aunt Matilda, had already surrendered to a fit of the vapors and retreated to the ladies' retiring room, leaving Elara adrift in a sea of silks and scrutiny. "Last year's cut, I do believe," a voice sharp and saccharine sliced through the din. Lady Beatrice Croft, a distant cousin with a viper's tongue and a fortune large enough to insulate her from its consequences, drifted near, her own gown a frothing confection of mint-green lace. "How sentimental of you, Elara, to cling to the past." Elara inclined her head, a cool mask of politeness her only shield. "It holds fond memories, Beatrice, a quality you might not appreciate." Beatrice's smile was a thin, unpleasant line. "Memories don't pay the dressmaker, my dear, or the butcher. I do hope you find a partner for the country dance. It would be a tragedy to stand alone all evening." With a final dismissive flick of her own opulent fan, she was gone, leaving the scent of expensive French perfume and casual cruelty in her wake. Elara's composure, so carefully constructed, threatened to crumble. Her gloved hands tightened on her fan until the delicate sticks groaned in protest. She was not merely attending a ball, she was on display in a marketplace, and she was keenly aware that her value was plummeting with every passing moment she remained against the wall. Her father's desperate, hopeful face swam before her eyes. "You are our only hope, Elara." The weight of it was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the very air from her lungs. It was then that a peculiar hush fell over the quadrant of the ballroom where she stood. The relentless tide of chatter receded, the music itself seeming to hold its breath. Elara looked up, following the collective gaze of the room, and her heart gave a painful, stuttering lurch. He had arrived, Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. The name was a paradox, for he shared her surname, but inhabited a different universe entirely. He was not a relation, merely a bearer of the same ancient name from a far more powerful, wealthier branch of the family tree. He was the most sought-after man in England, a figure of staggering wealth and crushing tragedy. They called him the Winter Duke, for it was said his heart had frozen solid the day his young wife died 2 years prior. He was never seen to smile. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a permanent, chilling distance. He was devastatingly handsome, a severe, classical beauty, carved from marble and shadow, and utterly, terrifyingly unapproachable. He moved through the glittering assembly not as a participant, but as a spectator at his own strange pageant. Lords bowed, ladies curtsied, their movements obsequious and hopeful, but he offered only the barest, most formal inclination of his head in return. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and cold, until inexplicably it stopped. On her, Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. He was looking past her, surely, at the ferns, at the tapestry behind her. But no, his eyes, intense and unnervingly direct, were fixed solely on her. A flush of heat, entirely separate from the room's stifling temperature, crept up her neck. She felt utterly exposed, her primrose gown suddenly a garish beacon of her family's poverty. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He, a dark, immovable pillar of power. She, a wilting flower in a borrowed pot. Then he began to move, not away but towards her. The crowd parted before him as if by silent command, a ripple of astonishment following in his wake. He ignored the hopeful glances of diamond-draped debutantes, the strategic positioning of ambitious mamas. He walked a straight, inexorable line to her corner of the room. Elara's mind went blank. She could think of nothing to say, no witty remark, no elegant pleasantry. She could only stand, frozen, as the most powerful and enigmatic man in the kingdom came to a halt before her. He was taller up close, his presence even more formidable. The air around him seemed cooler, charged with a silent, contained energy. He did not smile. His expression was one of severe neutrality. "Lady Alara Vance," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of warmth as his eyes. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. She sank into a curtsy, her movements stiff with shock. He gave a curt nod. "The orchestra is beginning the opening waltz. You will do me the honor." Again, it was not a question. It was a command, delivered with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had never been refused. Around them, jaws had literally dropped. Beatrice Croft's face was a mask of incandescent fury. Ilara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, sharp with envy and disbelief. She could do nothing but nod, her throat too tight for words. He extended a gloved hand. She placed her own trembling fingers into his grasp, and his touch was cool and firm, sending a strange, unsettling shiver through her. He led her onto the vast, polished expanse of the dance floor. The conductor, seeing the Duke had chosen his partner, tapped his baton, and the sweeping, romantic strains of the waltz filled the air. As he drew her into the formal hold of the dance, Ilara felt a dizzying sense of unreality. The Duke of Blackwood, who had not been seen on a dance floor since his wife's death, was opening the ball, with her, the girl in last year's silk. His hand rested on the small of her back, a point of cool, impersonal pressure through the thin fabric. His movements were fluid and precise, guiding her through the steps with an effortless authority that left her no choice but to follow. They danced in silence. The world spun around them in a blur of color and light, but their shared space was an island of quiet intensity. Ilara dared to lift her gaze from the stark white of his cravat to his face. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. His eyes were not on her, but on some distant point over her shoulder, as if he were dancing with a phantom. The intimacy of the dance was a jarring contradiction to the vast, empty space he maintained between them emotionally. She was in his arms, yet she had never felt more alone. Why? The question screamed in her mind. Why her? Was it a joke? A deliberate, cruel whim to pluck the most insignificant wallflower from obscurity and place her in the center of the spectacle, only to abandon her later? The thought was mortifying. As the final soaring notes of the waltz faded, he brought them to a graceful stop. He did not release her immediately. For the first time, his gaze dropped to meet hers, and the full, startling force of his stormy gray eyes struck her. There was no softness in them, no hint of admiration. There was only a cool, assessing intelligence. "You are a competent dancer, Lady Alara," he stated, his tone as flat as if he were commenting on the weather. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured, her cheeks burning. "Walk with me," he said, releasing her hand from his shoulder only to tuck it firmly into the crook of his arm. He led her from the dance floor, away from the prying eyes and gaping mouths, towards the French doors that opened onto the cool, shadowed terrace. The night air was a relief after the stifling ballroom. The scent of night-blooming jasmine hung heavy in the air, a sweet counterpoint to the turmoil in Ilara's chest. The Duke led her to a secluded stone balustrade overlooking the manicured gardens, the distant sounds of the orchestra a muted backdrop to the tense silence that stretched between them. He released her arm and turned to face her, his form a dark silhouette against the moonlit topiary. "Lady Ilara," he began, his voice low and devoid of any preamble, "I am aware of your family's circumstances." The blood drained from Ilara's face. The cool night air suddenly felt frigid. So this was it, not a whim, but a calculated act. He knew of their desperation. The knowledge was a profound humiliation, stripping away the last vestiges of her pride. "Your Grace is well informed," she said, her voice stiff. "I make it my business to be," he replied, unmoved by her tone. "Your father has leveraged everything he owns against a series of poor speculations in the West Indies trade. His creditors are circling. Within a month, he will be ruined. Your family will be destitute." Each word was a cold, hard stone, dropped into the quiet of the night. He spoke of her family's utter destruction with the dispassionate air of a solicitor reading a will. Ilara felt a surge of defiant anger. "And what concern is that of yours?" she asked, her chin lifting. He regarded her for a moment, his expression unchanging. "It is of concern to me because I have a proposition for you, a solution to your family's predicament and to mine." Ilara stared at him, bewildered. "A proposition?" "Indeed," he said. "I require a new duchess. My daughter needs a mother, and my house requires a mistress. The estate demands an heir. These are practical necessities I have neglected for too long." The sheer audacity of his statement left her speechless. He spoke of marriage as one might speak of hiring a new housekeeper. He continued, his voice a relentless, logical monotone. You, Lady Elara, possess an old and respectable name. You are of suitable birth and breeding. You are, by all accounts, intelligent, poised, and without scandal. You are also in a position where a significant marriage settlement would be persuasive. The transactional nature of his words was like a slap. He was not courting her, he was acquiring her. I am proposing marriage, he stated, as if there could be any doubt. In return for your hand, I will settle all of your father's debts. I will provide you with a generous personal allowance, the full rights and respect due to the Duchess of Blackwood, and a secure future for your family. They will want for nothing. It was a lifeline. It was salvation, offered on a silver platter. It was everything her father had prayed for, everything she had been brought to this ball to find. But the way he offered it, the cold, clinical finality in his tone, chilled her to the bone. There was no mention of affection, of companionship, of any of the softer things a young woman might dream of in a marriage. "And what," she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "do you ask of me in return, besides the production of an heir?" For the first time, a flicker of something, not quite emotion but a deeper shadow, moved in his eyes. He took a step closer, and the air grew heavy with his proximity. "I ask for your compliance," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a raw, quiet force. "This will be a marriage in name and duty only. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. You will manage my household. You will be a mother to my daughter. You will provide me with a son. But you will not expect affection from me. You will not expect my confidence, my companionship, or my heart. That is a price I am no longer capable of paying." He paused, letting the brutal terms of his contract settle in the air between them. "You will have your wing of the house. I will have mine. We will dine together when protocol demands it. We will appear in public as a unified couple. In private, we will be civil strangers. My life, my grief, my past, they are my own. You will not intrude upon them. Do you understand?" Elara felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. He was offering her a gilded cage, a life of immense privilege and profound emotional isolation. She would be a duchess, but she would never be a wife in any true sense of the word. She would be a functionary, a beautiful, well-compensated component in the running of his vast, empty life. Her dreams of a loving marriage, of a partner who would share her thoughts and laugh at her jests, withered and died in the space of that cold, moonlit pronouncement. But then she saw her father's face again, etched with worry. She saw her younger sisters, their futures hanging in the balance. She saw the shame of eviction, the stark reality of destitution. She had come here tonight, expecting to barter her future. She had not expected the terms to be so stark, the price so high. She would be trading one form of poverty for another, an emptiness of the purse for an emptiness of the soul. She looked at the Duke, at his handsome, remote face, at the unyielding sorrow in his eyes, and she saw a man as trapped as she was, albeit by different bars. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met his gaze without flinching. Her dreams were a luxury she could no longer afford. Her duty was clear. "I understand your terms, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "and I accept your proposal." The Duke of Blackwood did not smile. He simply gave a single, decisive nod, as if concluding a business transaction. "Very well. My solicitors will call upon your father in the morning." He offered his arm once more, and she took it. As he led her back toward the blaze of the ballroom, Elara felt the primrose silk of her gown brush against her skin. It was no longer the color of faded hope. It was the color of surrender. She was to be the Winter Duchess. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the cold was just beginning. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a study in grey. A persistent, drizzling rain wept from a sky the colour of slate, blurring the verdant countryside into a watercolour wash of greens and browns. Elara sat opposite the Duke in his perfectly sprung carriage, the silence between them as thick and oppressive as the damp air. He had not spoken a word beyond what was strictly necessary since their betrothal had been announced, a whirlwind affair that had stunned the ton and saved her family from ruin in one fell swoop. He read from a small leather-bound book, his attention so absolute that she felt she might as well have been a piece of luggage. She watched him from beneath her lashes, studying the severe line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his temple, the utter stillness of his hands as he held the book. He was a statue brought to life, magnificent and impenetrable. Her husband, the word felt foreign, absurd. They were signatories on a contract, nothing more. As they passed through a set of immense wrought-iron gates bearing a crest of a wolf's head, the landscape shifted. The rolling hills gave way to a denser, more ancient wood. The trees, gnarled oaks and solemn beeches crowded the road, their branches dripping with rain and moss. forming a canopy that plunged the carriage into a perpetual twilight. The estate felt less like a home and more like a kingdom unto itself, secluded and fiercely guarded. Then the manor itself came into view. It was a breathtaking edifice of grey stone, a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of towers, turrets, and mullioned windows that seemed to rise organically from the mist-shrouded land. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it possessed a melancholy grandeur that echoed its master. It did not look like a place of laughter or light. It looked like a place of secrets, a fortress built to keep the world at bay. The carriage crunched to a halt on a gravel drive before a massive oak door entrance. A line of servants, impossibly neat in their black and grey livery, stood waiting on the steps, their expressions as somber and disciplined as a row of chess pieces. At their head was a woman in her late 50s, her back ramrod straight, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun. The Duke alighted first, then turned and offered Ilara his hand. His touch was as brief and impersonal as ever. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice carrying easily in the damp air, "this is Mrs. Gable, my housekeeper. She will see to your needs." Mrs. Gable dipped into a flawless curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "welcome to Blackwood Manor." Her eyes, a shrewd, intelligent grey, met Ilara's, and for a fleeting moment, Ilara thought she saw a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or simple curiosity, before it was shuttered away behind a mask of professional deference. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms," the Duke stated, already turning towards the great doors. "I have business in my study." It was a dismissal, clear and final. He did not wait for a reply, simply strode into the house, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous entrance hall, and disappeared down a long, shadowed corridor. Ilara was left on the steps with the row of silent servants and the formidable housekeeper. The cold of his departure was more profound than the chill of the rain. She was the new duchess, the mistress of this great house, and yet she felt like an unwelcome guest. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, her tone perfectly neutral. The interior of the manor was as imposing as the exterior. A vast two-story hall with a soaring hammer-beam ceiling greeted them. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of beeswax, old stone, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of sorrow. Everything was immaculate, perfectly preserved, yet lifeless. Tapestries depicting grim hunting scenes absorbed the light from the high windows, and polished suits of armor stood like silent, empty sentinels in the corners. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, sweeping staircase, its carved banister cool beneath Ilara's gloved hand. "His Grace has had the Duchess's wing prepared for you," she explained, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet. "It is in the east part of the house. His Grace's own apartments are in the west wing." The arrangement he had outlined on the terrace was already a physical reality, a chasm of architecture separating them. Her wing, his wing. The words drew a line down the very center of their marriage. The Duchess's wing was a suite of rooms that would have dwarfed her family's entire London townhouse. A sitting room, decorated in shades of pale blue and silver, a spacious dressing room, and a bedroom dominated by a vast canopied bed draped in heavy silk brocade. It was luxurious, opulent, and utterly impersonal. There was no sign of the previous Duchess, no lingering trace of a personality. It had been scrubbed clean, rendered a beautiful, sterile shell. A young maid with wide, nervous eyes was waiting for them. "This is Agnes, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said. "She will be your personal maid." Agnes dropped into a wobbly curtsy, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Your Grace." "Thank you, Agnes," Ilara said, her voice softer than she intended. The girl's simple nervousness was a small human thing in this vast, formal house, and Ilara found herself clinging to it. Mrs. Gable seemed satisfied that her duties were discharged. "Dinner is served at 8, Your Grace. His Grace has indicated he will be dining in his study this evening. A tray will be brought to your sitting room, unless you prefer otherwise." "The sitting room will be fine, thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara replied, the formal words feeling strange on her tongue. Alone at last, with only the quiet maid for company, Ilara sank onto a silk-upholstered chaise longue, the sheer scale of her new reality pressing in on her. She walked to the large window. It overlooked a vast, sprawling expanse of what must have once been a magnificent garden, but now it was a ruin, a ghost of a garden. It was choked with weeds, the stone paths cracked and obscured by grasping ivy. A central fountain, its cherubic statues stained green with algae, was dry and silent. Rose bushes, untended for what must have been years, had grown into a thorny, chaotic tangle, their few remaining blooms small and pale. It was a place of profound neglect, a mirror of the desolation she felt in her own heart and sensed in the very stones of the manor. It was a perfect, heartbreaking symbol of the house and its master. A small movement at the edge of the wild garden caught her eye. A child, no older than 6, with dark flyaway hair, stood half hidden behind the gnarled trunk of an old apple tree. She was dressed in a simple grey frock and was watching the house with a solemn, unblinking intensity. Lily, the Duke's daughter, the child she was supposed to mother. As Ilara watched, a governess with a pinched face bustled out, took the child's hand in a firm grip, and led her back towards a less visible part of the estate. The little girl did not protest, she simply went, her small form disappearing behind a high stone wall. There had been no laughter, no chatter, just a silent, obedient retreat. The cold truce of her new life was laid bare before her. A husband who was a stranger, a daughter who was a ghost, a home that was a mausoleum, and a garden that was a grave. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, possessed of everything she could ever want, except for the one thing she truly needed, a human connection. The days that followed settled into a rigid, chilling routine. Ilara would wake, be dressed by the quiet Agnes, and take her breakfast alone in her sitting room. She would walk the cavernous, silent halls of the manor, a lonely queen in a kingdom of shadows. She would see the Duke only occasionally, a fleeting glimpse of his tall form disappearing into his study, or a brief, formal encounter in the grand hallway where he would incline his head, murmur, "Your Grace," and continue on his way. They were 2 ships passing in the fog, their proximity meaningless. She tried to learn the rhythms of the house. She spoke with Mrs. Gable, attempting to understand her duties as its mistress, but the housekeeper ran the estate with such ruthless efficiency that there was little for Ilara to do. The machine was already perfect. Her presence was superfluous. Her attempts to connect with her stepdaughter were met with a wall of silent resistance. Lily was a phantom child. Ilara would see her in the corridors, always accompanied by the stern Miss Finch, her governess. The child's eyes, the same stormy grey as her father's, would slide away from Ilara's, her expression shuttered and distant. She was a fortress, just like the Duke, and Ilara had no idea how to breach the walls. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive silence of the house, Ilara found her way to the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books that smelled of leather and time. A fire crackled in the hearth, the only spot of warmth and life she had found in the entire manor. She was running her fingers along the spine of a book of poetry when she heard a tiny sound, a soft rustle of fabric. She turned. Half hidden behind a large wing-back chair near the fire sat Lily, a small illustrated book open on her lap. She hadn't been reading it, she had been watching Ilara. The moment their eyes met, Lily flinched, her small body tensing, as if expecting a blow. She quickly looked down at her book, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Ilara's heart ached for the little girl. She wanted to rush over, to tell her not to be afraid, but she knew it would only frighten her more. Instead, she stayed where she was, her voice soft. "That looks like a wonderful story," she said gently. Lily did not respond. She remained utterly still, her shoulders hunched. Ilara pulled a book from the shelf, one she remembered from her own childhood, a collection of fanciful fairy tales. She settled into a chair on the other side of the hearth, a respectable distance away, and opened it. She did not try to speak to Lily again. Instead, she simply began to read, her voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room. She read of brave princesses and enchanted forests, of mischievous sprites and loyal animal companions. She read for nearly an hour, losing herself in the familiar cadence of the stories. When she finally paused and looked up, Lily was gone. But on the small table beside the girl's empty chair lay a single, perfectly formed daisy, its white petals stark against the dark, polished wood. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a welcome. But it was something. A crack in the ice, a tiny, fragile glimmer of possibility in the vast, cold emptiness of Blackwood Manor. And for Ilara, it was enough to kindle the first tentative spark of a quiet, resilient hope. The daisy became a talisman for Ilara, a secret she kept pressed between the pages of the book of fairy tales. It was a reminder that even in the most frozen of landscapes, something small and alive could find a way to grow. This thought took root in her mind, and soon turned her gaze back to the great neglected garden. It called to her, a silent, sprawling testament to a love that had been lost and a beauty that had been abandoned. She saw it not as a ruin, but as a promise. If she could bring life back to this patch of earth, perhaps she could coax some life back into the house itself. It was a foolish, romantic notion, but it was an action, a purpose, in a life that was rapidly becoming defined by passivity. She began her campaign not with a grand decree to the staff, but with a quiet, personal act of rebellion. One morning, after her solitary breakfast, she instructed a startled Agnes to find her a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and an old smock. Armed with these and a small trowel she discovered in a disused potting shed, she walked to the edge of the overgrown chaos and knelt. She started with a single stubborn thistle that was choking the life from a pale, struggling lavender bush. The earth was damp and resistant, but the simple physical act of working it was grounding. Her hands, usually pristine and pale, became smudged with dirt. A stray lock of hair escaped her neat coiffure and fell across her cheek. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood, she felt not like a duchess, but like herself. Her daily pilgrimage to the garden became a ritual. She focused on a small, manageable corner near the terrace, a patch that was visible from the library windows. She cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and pruned the thorny, tangled limbs of the old rose bushes with a tentative, hopeful hand. The manor's head gardener, a taciturn old man named Mr. Abernathy with hands like gnarled roots, watched her from a distance for 3 days, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. On the 4th day he approached, holding a pair of heavy shears. He did not speak, but simply knelt beside her and began to expertly cut away the dead wood from a particularly monstrous briar, his movements economical and sure. A silent partnership was formed. He would not take orders from her, but he would work alongside her, sharing his silent, earthy wisdom through action rather than words. Her other quiet campaign, the one for Lily's trust, continued in the library. Every afternoon she would go and read aloud. Sometimes Lily was there, a small silent presence in her usual chair. Sometimes she was not. But Ilara read anyway, sending the stories out into the quiet air like prayers. She never pressed the child for a response, never tried to bridge the physical distance between their chairs. She simply offered the gift of her voice and waited. One afternoon, as she was reading a passage about a hidden garden, she heard a tiny, hesitant voice. "There was a swing. There." Ilara stopped, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked up slowly. Lily was pointing a small finger towards the window which overlooked the section of the garden where Ilara had been working. "A swing?" Ilara asked, keeping her voice calm and gentle. Lily nodded, her eyes wide and serious. "On the big oak tree. Mama used to push me." The mention of her mother was a fragile, precious thing, a key turning in a long-locked door. "That sounds lovely," Ilara said softly. Perhaps Mr. Abernathy and I can clear the ivy from that tree to see if it's still there." Lily said nothing more, retreating back into her shell of silence, but she did not leave. She stayed until Ilara finished the chapter, her gaze flitting between Ilara's face and the window, a silent, hopeful query hanging in the air. The Duke remained a distant, formidable presence. Ilara was certain he was aware of her activities. Little happened at Blackwood without his knowledge. But he made no comment. He continued to take his meals alone, to spend his days locked in his study, a ghost haunting the west wing of his own house. Yet, Ilara began to notice small changes, cracks in his impenetrable facade. One evening, as she passed the library on her way to her rooms, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Peeking in, she saw him standing by the hearth, not reading, but holding the very book of fairy tales she read from each day. He was not looking at the pages, but staring into the fire, his expression lost in some deep, inaccessible memory. He seemed not like the cold, authoritative Duke, but like a man achingly alone. He closed the book and placed it back on the mantelpiece with a strange reverence, before turning and leaving through a different door. He never knew she had seen him. A few days later, a more direct acknowledgement occurred. Ilara was in her corner of the garden, her hands deep in the soil, as she planted a row of violet slips she'd found growing wild near the woods. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear him approach. "It is an ambitious undertaking," his voice, so close behind her, made her jump. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt from her smock, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and surprise. He stood on the stone path, impeccably dressed in a dark riding coat, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked entirely out of place in her messy, half-tamed corner of the world. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a small, awkward curtsy. "I did not hear you." He did not reprimand her for her appearance, for the smudge of dirt on her cheek or the disarray of her hair. His gaze moved over the patch of cleared earth, the neatly pruned roses, the newly turned soil. His face was, as always, a mask of cool neutrality, but his eyes seemed to hold a different quality today, a sharp, focused attention that was almost unnerving. "My late wife designed this garden," he said, the statement falling into the quiet air with the weight of a stone. It was her creation, her sanctuary. Ilara's heart clenched. She had been tending a shrine without even knowing it. It is a beautiful design, she said quietly. It deserves to be brought back to life. He looked from the garden to her, and for a heartbeat the chasm between them seemed to shrink. The cold distance in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a deep, profound sorrow that was so potent it almost stole her breath. It was there, and then gone, his mask slipping back into place as quickly as it had fallen. "See that you do it justice," he said, his voice once again cool and remote. He turned on his heel and walked away without another word, his tall form disappearing around a corner of the house. Ilara stood frozen, her trowel clutched in her hand. It was not a compliment, it was not encouragement, it was a charge, a heavy responsibility laid at her feet. But it was also the first time he had spoken to her of his late wife. He had shared a piece of his past, a tiny, fractured shard of his story. And as she looked at the struggling rose bushes, she felt a new sense of purpose settle over her. She was not just tending a garden, she was tending a memory, and in a life defined by a cold, loveless contract, it felt astonishingly like a sacred trust. The change in the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor was not sudden, but gradual, like the turning of a season. It began with the garden. As Ilara and Mr. Abernathy toiled, their silent companionship blossoming into a comfortable rhythm, so too did the earth respond. Green shoots pushed through the dark soil. The rose bushes, freed from their thorny prisons, began to produce fat, healthy buds. They uncovered the old swing on the oak tree, its ropes rotted but its wooden seat intact, and Mr. Abernathy quietly replaced the ropes one afternoon without being asked. The day Lily first used the swing was a quiet triumph. Ilara was reading in the library when she saw the flash of movement from the corner of her eye. The little girl was swinging, not high, but with a gentle rhythmic push of her feet, her dark hair flying back from her face. For the first time, Ilara saw the ghost of a smile on her lips. Lily began to seek Ilara out, not just in the library but in the garden too. She would appear silently at Ilara's side as she worked, a small shadow offering a freshly picked wildflower or pointing out a ladybug crawling on a leaf. The wall of silence around the child was crumbling, brick by fragile brick, replaced by hesitant questions and whispered observations. The Duke observed all of this from a distance. Ilara would sometimes feel his eyes on her from his study window as she and Lily sat on a newly repaired stone bench, examining a caterpillar. He never joined them, he never spoke of it, but the quality of his silence had changed. It felt less like cold indifference and more like watchful waiting. One afternoon, a package arrived for Ilara. It was a long, flat box, wrapped in brown paper. Inside, cushioned in tissue, lay a complete set of the finest gardening tools she had ever seen. Polished steel trowels with rosewood handles, sharp, elegant shears, and supple leather gloves that fit her hands perfectly. There was no card, no note, but she knew with an unshakable certainty who had sent them. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes more than his clipped, formal words ever could. Her heart beat a little faster as she ran her fingers over the smooth, cool wood of a handle. It was the first gift he had ever given her. The slow, tentative thaw at Blackwood was abruptly threatened by the arrival of a letter, its envelope sealed with a familiar, ostentatious crest. Lady Beatrice Croft, her ambitious and venomous cousin, was inviting herself for a visit. She wrote of her desire to see dear Ilara settled and to meet the Duke's charming daughter, her words a cloying syrup of feigned affection that did little to hide the sharp, probing intent beneath. Ilara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Beatrice's presence was a poison. She thrived on discord and delighted in exposing the weaknesses of others. To have her here in this fragile, budding peace felt like inviting a fox into a henhouse. She felt compelled to inform the Duke. She found him in the hall, preparing to go riding. Standing before him, her hands clasped nervously, she told him of her cousin's impending visit. He listened, his expression unreadable, his gloved hands holding a riding crop. "Lady Beatrice is your family," he said, his tone flat. "You may receive her as you see fit. Instruct Mrs. Gable to prepare the guest suites." "But Alistair," she began, the use of his first name slipping out in her anxiety. She corrected herself immediately. "Your Grace, I am not certain her visit is wise. She can be." Ilara struggled for a diplomatic word. "She's difficult." "This is your house now, Lady Ilara," he said, his gaze cool and direct. "You are its Duchess. You will learn to manage difficult guests." With that, he turned and strode out of the door, leaving her with the cold weight of his expectations. He would not help her. This was her battle to fight. Beatrice arrived 2 days later in a flurry of trunks and imperious commands to the footman. She swept into the great hall, her vibrant peacock blue traveling dress a jarring slash of color against the somber gray stone. "Ilara, my dearest!" she exclaimed, enveloping Ilara in a brief, stiff embrace that smelled of lily of the valley and insincerity. What a magnificent pile of stone, so grand, and so very quiet. Her eyes swept the hall, taking in its scale and its shadows, a flicker of avarice in their depths. This was the prize she felt had been stolen from her. The visit began as a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. Beatrice's conversation was a minefield of backhanded compliments and subtle digs. "How wonderfully said domestic you've become, Ilara," she remarked at dinner, the first meal the Duke had taken with them in the formal dining room since Beatrice's arrival. "Tending the garden with your own hands. It's almost rustic. I suppose it reminds you of your country roots." Ilara merely smiled. "I find it rewarding. It is a pleasure to nurture something and watch it grow." The Duke sat at the head of the table, a silent, brooding presence. He ate little and said less, his hooded gaze missing nothing. Beatrice's primary target, however, was not Ilara, but Lily. She descended upon the child with a suffocating predatory sweetness, showering her with expensive dolls and sugary compliments. "You poor dear child," she would coo, stroking Lily's hair. "It must be so lonely for you here. Do you remember your real mamma, darling? She was so beautiful, so full of life. Not at all the quiet type." Ilara watched, her hands clenched in her lap, as Lily would withdraw, her small face closing up, the tentative light in her eyes dimming under Beatrice's relentless assault. Miss Finch, the governess, seemed to approve of Beatrice's attentions, seeing her as a more suitable influence of high society than the dirt-stained Duchess. The crisis came on the third day of the visit. It was a rare, sunny afternoon, and Ilara had taken Lily to the garden to see the first of the roses that had bloomed, a deep, velvety crimson. Lily was touching a petal with a single reverent finger when Beatrice appeared on the terrace, a silken shawl draped elegantly around her shoulders. "There you are," she called out, her voice bright and false. "Lily, darling, come away from those filthy plants. You'll ruin your frock. Let's go inside and I shall tell you a story about a real princess who lived in a castle far grander than this." Lily flinched at the sharp tone and took a half-step back, closer to Ilara. "Lily is quite happy here, Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice even but firm. Beatrice's smile became a sneer. "Oh, I'm sure she is. Playing in the dirt with you? But a duke's daughter needs refinement, Ilara. She needs to be taught her station, not how to pull weeds. You are turning her into a common little country mouse." She took a step forward, her hand outstretched towards Lily. "Come along, child. Leave your governess to her hobbies." The insult was clear, demoting Ilara to the status of a servant in her own home. But it was the look of genuine fear on Lily's face that made something snap inside Ilara. She moved instinctively, placing herself between Beatrice and the child. "That is enough, Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice low and shaking with a cold fury she had not known she possessed. "You will not speak to her that way. You will not speak to me that way. You are a guest in this house, and you will remember your place." Beatrice laughed, a high, ugly sound. "My place? And what is yours, precisely? A convenient, penniless bride bought to serve a purpose? Do you truly believe you mean anything to him? He mourns a goddess. He's settled for a servant. And once you have given him his heir, you will be just as neglected as this pathetic garden was." Each word was a poisoned dart, and they found their mark. Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes, a hot surge of humiliation and pain, but before she could respond, a shadow fell over them. "You are mistaken, Lady Beatrice." The Duke's voice was soft, dangerously so. He had come from the house so silently that none of them had heard him. He stood on the path, his face a thunderous mask of cold rage. He was not looking at Ilara, but at Beatrice, and the sheer glacial fury in his eyes made even her take a step back. "My wife," he continued, his voice lethally calm, "is the Duchess of Blackwood. She is the mistress of this house and everything in it. That includes my daughter. You will afford her the respect that title commands, or you will not remain under my roof." Beatrice's face paled. She opened her mouth to offer some blustering excuse, but he cut her off. "I heard your comments, all of them." His gaze was utterly unforgiving. "Your visit has come to an end. My carriage will be ready to take you back to London within the hour." It was a dismissal as swift and brutal as an execution. Beatrice, for once in her life, was rendered speechless. She shot Ilara a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, then turned and swept back into the house, her dignity in tatters. The silence that followed was profound. Ilara stood, trembling, not daring to look at her husband. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, and his voice had held the ring of absolute possession. He had chosen her. He walked over to where Lily stood, half hidden behind Ilara's skirts. He knelt, an action so unexpected it made Ilara gasp. He was now at eye level with his daughter. "Are you all right, Lily?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Lily nodded, her eyes wide as she stared at her father. He reached out and with a startlingly gentle touch tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "Your mother, your first mother, loved this garden more than anything. She would be very happy to see you here, and she would be very proud of the Duchess for making it beautiful again." He looked up then, his stormy grey eyes meeting Ilara's. The rage was gone, replaced by an emotion she could not name. A complex mixture of gratitude, regret, and a startling raw vulnerability. The walls he had so carefully constructed around himself had been breached not by her, but by his own fierce protective instinct. In that moment, standing amidst the blooming roses, with the scent of damp earth in the air and the warmth of the sun on her face, Ilara knew that everything had changed. Their cold contract had been fractured, and in its place, an unfamiliar, fragile, and utterly terrifying alliance had just been forged. The aftermath of Beatrice's departure left a strange, vibrating silence in its wake. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, but for Ilara and the Duke, the silence was of a different sort. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken words, with the memory of his defense and the startling intimacy of his confession in the garden. The formal distance they had maintained was now an awkward fiction. A wall had been torn down, and they were left standing in the rubble, unsure of how to navigate the newly exposed landscape. That evening, a footman delivered a message. His Grace requested the Duchess's presence for dinner in the main dining room. It was a summons, but it felt different from a command. It felt like an invitation. Ilara took extra care with her appearance, choosing a gown of deep forest green that complemented the tentative life returning to the garden. As she entered the dining room, she found him already there, standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He turned as she entered, and for the first time, he offered her a real, if faint, smile. It transformed his severe features, hinting at the man he might have been before tragedy remade him. "Ilara," he said, using her given name for the first time without the formal title attached. "Thank you for joining me." The meal was a quiet affair, but the quiet was comfortable, companionable. He asked her about the garden, about the names of the flowers she was planting. He spoke of his estate, of the tenant farms, and the village that depended on Blackwood. He was sharing his world with her, not just the house, but the responsibilities that came with it. After dinner, he did not retreat to his study. Instead, he asked, "Will you walk with me?" He led her not to the terrace, but to the long gallery, a vast room lined with portraits of his ancestors. They stared down from the walls, their expressions stern and judgmental, a long line of vances through the centuries, but Alistair did not look at them. He led her to the very end of the gallery, to a single portrait covered by a heavy velvet curtain. He paused before it, his hand resting on the cord. "There is something you should see, something you should have been told from the beginning." He pulled the cord. The velvet slid away, revealing the life-sized portrait of a young woman. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with a cascade of fiery auburn hair, a mischievous smile, and eyes that sparkled with life and laughter. She stood in a garden, the garden, Ilara realized with a jolt, but a garden in its full, glorious prime, bursting with color and sunlight. This was Isabella, his first duchess, the goddess Beatrice had spoken of. Ilara felt a pang of inadequacy so sharp it was like a physical blow. She was a pale shadow next to this vibrant, sun-drenched creature. "She was beautiful," Ilara whispered. "She was the sun," Alistair said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "She could light up a room just by entering it. This house was never quiet when she was alive." He stared at the portrait, his face a mask of sorrow. "And I am the one who extinguished that light." A storm had been gathering all evening, and now the first roll of thunder echoed in the distance. Rain began to lash against the tall gallery windows, the wind moaning around the eaves of the old house. The weather seemed to answer the turmoil in the room. "You blame yourself for her death," Ilara stated softly. It was not a question. He finally tore his gaze from the portrait and looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was terrible to behold. "Beatrice was right about one thing. I do mourn her every single day, but it is not just grief, Ilara. It is guilt, a guilt that has consumed me." He began to pace, the contained energy he always held now crackling around him like lightning. "It was an accident. That is the official story. That is what the world believes. And it is true in a way, but it is an incomplete truth." He stopped and faced her, his expression raw, stripped of all artifice. "We had argued. It was a stupid, meaningless fight. I cannot even recall the cause. But I have a temper. A coldness. When I am angry, I retreat behind walls of ice. I said things, cruel things. I wounded her with my silence, with my withdrawal. It was my weapon of choice." The rain beat a furious tattoo against the glass. She was all fire and passion. She could not bear my coldness. She ran from me, out into the garden. Even though a storm, much like this one, was breaking, she wanted me to follow her, to fight with her, to show some passion, even if it was anger. That was her way. He swallowed hard, his throat working. But I did not. My pride, my stubborn, foolish pride, kept me inside. I let her go. I told myself I would wait for her to calm down, for the storm to pass. His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. The storm did not pass, it worsened. I waited too long. By the time I went after her, it was too late. She had slipped on the wet stones by the fountain, the very stones you have been clearing of moss. She hit her head. When I found her, he closed his eyes, the memory too painful to face. She was gone. I was too late. He opened his eyes and they were swimming with a pain so profound it made Alara's own heart ache in sympathy. Do you see now? It was not just the fall that killed her. It was my pride, my coldness, my inability to love her fiercely enough to overcome a moment of anger. I locked away the garden because it was a monument to my failure. I locked away my heart because I did not trust it not to fail again. I shut Lily out because I was afraid that the coldness in me would somehow harm her too. The confession hung in the air, a raw, bleeding wound. He had not just lost his wife. He believed he had caused her death. He had sentenced himself to a lifetime of penance, living in a self-imposed prison of grief and guilt. Ilara felt the last of her resentment. Her fear, her feelings of inadequacy wash away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. She saw him not as the cold, intimidating duke, but as a broken man, desperately trying to keep the shards of his life from cutting anyone else. She closed the distance between them, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not touch him. She simply stood before him, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm. It was a tragedy, Alistair, she said, her voice clear and steady amidst the drumming of the rain. A terrible, terrible tragedy, but it was not a murder. You did not push her. You did not cause the stone to be slippery or the rain to fall. You are guilty of having an argument with your wife. You are guilty of being human. You are not guilty of her death. He stared at her, his breathing ragged, as if her words were in a language he had long forgotten. You have been punishing yourself for 2 years, she continued softly. You have punished this house, and you have punished your daughter. Isn't it enough? Isabella loved life. The woman in that portrait would not want this. She would not want this silence, this sorrow. She would want to see her daughter smile. She would want to see her garden bloom again. Tears were now tracking freely down his face. The first tears, she suspected, he had allowed himself to shed in 2 long years. The great, impenetrable Duke of Blackwood was weeping. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders shook with the force of his silent grief, and in that moment, Ilara did the only thing she could. She reached out, her hand hesitant at first, and then firm, and placed it on his arm, a simple human touch, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, of shared sorrow. He did not pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, his grip desperate, clinging to her as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. The storm raged outside. But inside the long gallery, in the shared space of his confession and her compassion, the first fragile rays of a new dawn were beginning to break through the darkness. The night of the storm became the axis on which their world turned. The confession once spoken could not be unsaid. The shared vulnerability could not be retracted. Alistair's grief, finally allowed an escape, left him hollowed out, exhausted, but also strangely lighter. The immense burden of his solitary guilt had been shared, and in sharing it, its power had been diminished. He did not retreat to the West Wing that night. After his tears subsided, a profound weariness settled over him. Ilara led him, not to his own cold, empty chambers, but to the library, the one room in the house that held a flicker of warmth. She settled him into the large wing-backed chair by the now dying fire, and wrapped a heavy woolen blanket around his shoulders. He submitted to her care with a quiet, trusting passivity that touched her more deeply than any declaration could have. She intended to leave him to his rest, to retreat to her own rooms and allow him the privacy to compose himself, but as she turned to go, his hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was gentle but firm. "Stay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please." It was the first thing he had ever truly asked of her, not as a duke commanding a duchess, but as a man asking for comfort. She could not refuse. She pulled a low footstool closer to his chair and sat, keeping a silent vigil as the storm outside slowly exhausted itself, and the first grey hints of dawn began to pale the sky. She watched him sleep, his proud, severe features softened and made younger by repose. The formidable duke was gone, and in his place was only Alistair, a man who had suffered and was, perhaps, finally beginning to heal. When he awoke, the sun was streaming through the library windows, washing the room in a clean, hopeful light. He looked at her, his eyes clear of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. A new awareness was there, a recognition of her not as a solution to a problem or a component of a contract, but as a woman, a person who had seen him at his most broken and had not turned away. "Ilara," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. He reached out and brushed his thumb over the back of her hand, which still rested on the arm of his chair. The touch was electric, a simple, skin-to-skin contact that felt more intimate than the entirety of their brief, formal waltz. A new, unspoken language began to develop between them in the days that followed. They began to take all their meals together. He would seek her out in the garden, not to watch from a distance, but to walk the newly cleared paths with her, his long strides easily matching her shorter ones. He asked her opinion on estate matters, listening to her thoughts with a focused intensity that made her feel for the first time like a true partner. He made an effort with Lily, a clumsy, heart-wrenching effort at first. He started joining them in the library for her reading sessions, sitting in a chair nearby, pretending to read his own book, but Ilara knew he was listening to every word. One afternoon he took Lily to the stables and, with a gentle patience Ilara would never have thought him capable of, lifted her onto the back of a small, steady pony. The sound of Lily's delighted, uninhibited laughter echoed across the stable yard, a sound so rare and precious it brought tears to Ilara's eyes. He caught her watching, and the look that passed between them was one of shared, profound joy. The physical space between them was shrinking too, a hand on the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway, his shoulder brushing against hers as they examined a map of the estate. A shared glance across the dinner table that lingered a moment too long. The air between them grew charged with a different kind of tension, no longer one of coldness and formality, but of a burgeoning, unspoken attraction. The true turning point came a week after the storm. It was a warm, languid evening. They had walked in the garden after dinner, the air sweet with the scent of night stock and newly mown grass. The moon was full, bathing the restored flower beds in a silvery, ethereal light. They stopped by the fountain, the source of so much of his past pain. It was clean now, the water burbling softly, the cherubic statues no longer stained with neglect. "You have wrought a miracle here," Alistair said, his voice a low murmur in the twilight. "I only uncovered what was already here," Ilara replied softly. "The design was strong, the roots were deep. It just needed some care." He turned to her, his tall frame silhouetted against the moonlight. "Like this house, like its master." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Ilara, I have been living in a tomb of my own making. You came into this house, into my life, and you did not try to break down the doors. You simply planted a garden and read stories, and quietly, patiently, showed me that the sun could shine again. You did not demand my heart, but you have, against all my defenses, captured it." Her breath hitched. The words she had never dared to even dream of hearing were being spoken here, in this place of rebirth. He lifted his other hand and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. His eyes, the color of the sea by moonlight, were filled with an emotion that was so open, so sincere, it made her heart ache. "My proposal on that terrace in London was the most dishonorable act of my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I offered you a cage, however gilded. I asked you to be a function, not a wife. I was wrong. I am asking you now, not as a duke to a lady, but as a man to a woman. Can you forgive me? Can we begin again?" Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of a relief so profound it felt like a dam breaking within her. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. He searched her face, his gaze intense. "Is there a chance, Ilara? Could you come to care for a man like me?" "Oh, Alistair," she breathed, a small, watery laugh escaping her. "Don't you know, I already do." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile, beautiful truth. A slow smile spread across his face, the first truly radiant smile she had ever seen from him. It was like watching the sun rise, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite fiction or desperate grief. It was a kiss of profound, breathtaking truth. It was gentle at first, a question, a discovery. Then, as she responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, it deepened, becoming a conversation of all the things they had never been able to say. It was a kiss full of gratitude, of sorrow, of hope, and of a love that had taken root in the most barren of soils, and had, against all odds, blossomed. In the moonlit garden, surrounded by the quiet testimony of their shared work, the Winter Duke and his unlikely Duchess sealed a new contract, not of convenience or duty, but of a love that was all the more precious for having been so hard won. The kiss in the garden was a covenant, a silent promise that remade their world. The invisible line that had divided the manor into his wing and hers dissolved overnight. The following morning, when Agnes came to Ilara's room, she found it empty, the bed unslept in. A quiet, knowing smile touched the maid's lips as she drew the curtains against the morning sun. Life at Blackwood was transformed. The house, which had for so long felt like a mausoleum, began to feel like a home. Laughter, once an alien sound within its stone walls, became a frequent guest. It was Lily's laughter, echoing from the garden as Alistair pushed her on the swing, higher and higher, her feet kicking towards the sky. It was Ilara's laughter, a warm, musical sound, as Alistair recounted a dryly witty story about a pompous local magistrate over the dinner table. Most astonishingly, it was Alistair's own laughter, a deep rumbling sound of genuine amusement that seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. He was a man reborn. The cold, remote Duke was a phantom, replaced by a man who was attentive, warm, and deeply in love. He delighted in the simple domesticity he had once scorned. He would appear in the garden as Ilara worked, not as an inspector, but as a fellow laborer, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on his aristocratic cheek as he helped her transplant a row of delphiniums. He would read to Lily himself in the evenings, his deep baritone giving voice to knights and dragons, his daughter curled trustingly against his side. He courted Ilara with a tender, focused intensity that left her breathless. He seemed determined to erase the memory of their cold beginning, to replace it with 1,000 small, perfect moments. He would leave a single, perfect rose on her pillow in the morning. He would discover her favorite poet and have a rare first edition waiting for her in the library. They would ride out together across the vast expanse of the estate, the wind in their hair, their hands brushing as they held the reins, their conversation easy and unending. He shared his thoughts, his fears for the harvest, his hopes for the estate's future. He opened his mind to her just as he had opened his heart. One afternoon, he came to her with a small, velvet-wrapped box. Inside was not a grand ducal jewel, but a simple, exquisitely crafted silver locket. "It's empty," he said, watching her face. "The past is the past. Isabella will always be a part of this house, a part of my story. I will never dishonor her memory, but our future, Ilara, our future is a blank page, waiting for us to write upon it. It belongs to us." Tears filled her eyes as she looked from his earnest, open face to the locket in her hand. It was the most romantic, most thoughtful gift she had ever received. He had not tried to replace the past, but to build a new future alongside it. He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The cool metal felt like a promise against her heart. They began to entertain, not the grand, formal affairs of the London season, but small, intimate dinners with trusted neighbors and estate tenants. Ilara, once the girl in the faded silk dress, now presided as Duchess, her quiet grace and genuine warmth winning the hearts of all who met her. She was not just a figurehead, she was the heart of the home, and Alistair, in the way he constantly looked to her, deferred to her. His eyes full of pride and love made that clear to everyone. He was no longer the Winter Duke, he was simply Ilara's husband. Their love, once a fragile seedling, grew strong and deep, its roots intertwined with the daily rhythms of their life together. The physical intimacy they discovered was a revelation, a joyful expression of the profound emotional connection they had forged. In the quiet darkness of their shared bed, all titles and past sorrows fell away, and they were simply a man and a woman who had found in each other an unexpected and miraculous solace. One crisp autumn morning, months after their new beginning, Ilara sought out Alistair in his study. The door, once a symbol of his isolation, was now always open to her. She found him at his desk, frowning over a ledger. He looked up as she entered, his expression immediately softening into a smile. "Is something wrong?" he asked, seeing the nervous, excited energy she seemed to be radiating. She came to stand beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. She said nothing, but simply placed his large, warm hand on her still flat stomach. He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. A slow, incredulous joy spread across his face, so pure and potent it was dazzling. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. She nodded, her smile trembling. "We are to have a child." He rose from his chair and gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in a circle, his laughter echoing in the book-lined room. He set her down gently, his hands framing her face, his forehead resting against hers. "An heir," he whispered, but the word held none of its former cold weight. It was not about duty or contracts, it was about love and family, and the miraculous continuation of life. A new beginning in every sense of the word. He kissed her then, a kiss of pure, unadulterated happiness, a celebration of the family they had built from the ashes of grief and the foundations of a loveless bargain. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor had finally been laid to rest, replaced by the vibrant, hopeful promise of the future. A year to the day after Ilara had first arrived at Blackwood Manor, she stood on the terrace, a healthy, dark-haired baby boy sleeping soundly in her arms. It was a perfect summer afternoon, and the garden below was a riot of color, a living tapestry of crimson roses, purple lavender, and blue delphiniums. The fountain bubbled merrily, its waters sparkling in the sun. Lily, now a bright, chattering 7-year-old, was chasing a butterfly down a stone path, her laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Alistair came to stand behind Ilara, wrapping his arms around her and their son. He pressed a kiss to her hair, his chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out over the scene of their shared life. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" he murmured into her ear. "At the Beaumont's ball?" "How could I forget?" she smiled. "I was the girl in last year's silk." "I saw you across the room," he confessed, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "and the entire glittering, noisy room just faded away. There was something about you, a quiet strength, a stillness. You looked like the only real person there. I knew in that moment that you were the one. I didn't understand it then. My motives were cold, practical. But my heart, it seems, knew better than my head." She leaned back against his solid warmth, her heart full to bursting. The journey had been long and fraught with a winter of the soul. But the summer they had found was all the sweeter for it. She was no longer the girl in the faded dress, a pawn in a game of fortune. She was a wife, a mother, a partner. She was beloved. She looked from the sleeping face of her son to the laughing face of her daughter, to the vibrant life of the garden, and finally up to the face of the man she loved. A man who had journeyed back from the depths of sorrow to find her. The Duke of Blackwood had found his summer, and she, Lady Ilara, was its sun. Dear listener, isn't it a curious thing how we sometimes mistake a fortress for a ruin? We look at people who have surrounded themselves with high walls and cold silences, and we see only emptiness, only a place that has been abandoned by joy. We see the Winter Duke, the man locked away with his grief, and we assume the story is over, but Ilara's story reminds us that beneath the most neglected garden, the roots often run deep. Her journey wasn't one of grand, heroic gestures. She didn't storm the castle of Alistair's heart. She simply chose a small, forgotten corner of his world and began to tend to it. With quiet patience, with dirt under her fingernails, and a story on her lips, she cultivated a space for life to return. She didn't demand that he change. She created an environment where change became possible. So often in our own lives, we are faced with relationships that feel like cold contracts, or with people who seem locked behind impenetrable doors. Our first instinct might be to turn away, to seek out sunnier, more welcoming landscapes. Or perhaps we try to force the door open, demanding entry into spaces we have not yet earned the right to enter. Ilara chose a third path, the path of quiet. Compassion. She saw the pain behind the coldness, the guilt behind the anger. She understood that his harsh terms were not a rejection of her, but a reflection of his own brokenness. She accepted the terms, but she did not accept the desolation. She brought her own warmth, her own life into the cold spaces, and waited patiently for it to take root. This story is a powerful reminder that healing is often a quiet, collaborative process. It is about showing up day after day and tending to the small things. It's about pulling one weed, then another. It's about reading a story into a silent room, not knowing if anyone is truly listening. It is the profound act of offering warmth without demanding it in return. Alistair could only begin to heal when he finally allowed someone to share the burden of his guilt, to see him in his deepest shame and reflect back not judgment, but compassion. Perhaps there is a neglected garden in your own life, a relationship, a dream, or even a part of yourself that you have locked away after a period of sorrow. Perhaps you feel you are the one living in a fortress of your own making. Ilara's courage teaches us that it is never too late to let the sun in, and Alistair's journey shows us that no winter, no matter how long and how cold, is eternal. Summer can return, often in the most unexpected of ways, through the quiet, persistent, and revolutionary act of simple human kindness. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the most frozen hearts can learn to bloom again.